Purchased a condo, seller rented it to his nephew at $1 for 36 months, the day before contracts were signed. Now what? The day we were finally supposed to move into our new condo started like any other. My wife and I woke up early, running on adrenaline and excitement, ready to settle into the place we had spent months securing. We had done everything by the book: pre-approval, contract negotiations, final walkthrough, closing. The unit had been sitting vacant for roughly 60 days, untouched, exactly as we had seen it before. The day before closing, we did a final walkthrough, making sure everything was in order. No deadbolt on the door, no sign of life inside. It was our home, and all that was left was the move. The truck was packed, a friend's business had lent it to us so we could move at our own pace, and we had officially turned in the keys to our old apartment that morning. The timing wasn't ideal, but everything seemed to be lining up perfectly. Until we arrived at the condo. The moment we stepped up to the door, my stomach twisted. There was a deadbolt. A brand new, shiny, unfamiliar deadbolt that had not been there the last time we checked. We knocked. No answer. We knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My wife and I exchanged a look, the kind of silent conversation where everything is understood without words. This wasn't right. I reached out to our realtor immediately. If there was any logical explanation, he would be the one to get it. He got in touch with the seller's agent, pressing for information, demanding to know what was going on. Meanwhile, we stood there, surrounded by all our belongings in the back of the truck, locked out of the place we legally owned. The weight of what this might mean started to sink in. Squatters. The word alone made my blood boil. An hour passed. We were running out of options. The truck wasn't a permanent solution, and we had nowhere to go. My wife sat on the curb, arms crossed, jaw clenched, her patience wearing thin. And then, finally, someone appeared. A young man strolled up to the unit like he had all the time in the world. I stepped forward, bracing myself, and before I could say a word, he produced a lease. A 36-month lease. Paid in advance. All $1 of it. I took the paper from him, staring at the absurdity of it. He had been living in our condo for $1. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the document. The lease had been dated exactly 1 day before our contract. It was an insult. A joke. A blatant scam. The young man, completely unfazed, looked at me and said it was between me and his uncle. Then he turned, unlocked the door with his key, and disappeared inside our home. I was speechless. My wife was speechless. Our realtor was speechless. This wasn't just some random squatter breaking in, this was planned. Deliberate. The seller had gone out of their way to create a fake lease, just barely predating our purchase, and then conveniently disappeared, leaving us to deal with the fallout. We called the police, expecting at least some sort of intervention. Surely, they would see this for what it was, a clear-cut case of fraud. Instead, they told us it was a civil matter. As far as they were concerned, the man had a lease, and that was enough. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. So what if it was clearly fraudulent? So what if it was literally $1 for 3 years? As long as there was paperwork, the police wouldn't touch it. I felt sick. The condo association, the one that had been so appealing because of its hands-off approach to rentals, was too hands-off to help us now. They didn't care. The board refused to get involved, shrugging it off as a private dispute. I called the attorney who handled our closing, desperate for any legal guidance. Voicemail. Then his assistant finally got back to me. He was out of town, somewhere remote, completely unreachable. The timing couldn't have been worse. We had no lawyer, no home, and all of our belongings were locked inside a truck that we only had access to because of a generous friend. I had no idea what to do. Cash for keys was an option, but the guy wouldn't even acknowledge us. If I slipped a note under the door, would he even read it? Would he just dig in his heels even further? The very idea of paying him anything felt disgusting, like rewarding fraud. But the alternative, going through eviction court, spending months in legal limbo, bleeding money on top of the mortgage I was already paying, felt just as unbearable. If eviction was the only option, what were my rights? Could I sue the seller? Could I recover the cost of moving twice, of storage, of potential legal fees? Could my friend, whose truck was now an impromptu storage unit, go after them for damages? My mind raced in circles, searching for solutions that didn't exist. We had done everything right. Followed every step. And yet, we were standing in front of our home, homeless. The only thing left was anger. Anger at the seller for setting this up, at the police for refusing to help, at the system that made this possible. Update 1. Just when I thought the day couldn't possibly get more surreal, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something told me to answer. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was just the feeling that things were teetering on the edge of something breaking open, one way or another. I swiped to pick up, pressing the phone to my ear, and before I could even say a word, my attorney's admin launched into an update. Apparently, he wasn't as deep into the wilderness as I'd thought. Close enough to civilization to get an internet connection, at least, which meant close enough for her to send word about the absolute disaster I was dealing with. And from what she told me, it sounded like he was more than happy to have an excuse to step back into his old world. Before he'd retired into real estate law, he had been a civil litigator, and from the way she said it, I could almost hear the thinly veiled amusement in her voice. Like she knew exactly what kind of energy he was going to bring to this case. And honestly, that was exactly what I wanted to hear. Because as much as I was shaking with anger, as much as I wanted to march back to my condo and start ripping that door down with my bare hands, I also knew that wasn't the way this was going to play out. Not if I wanted to come out on top. This wasn't just some random squatter situation. This was malicious. The seller hadn't just been shady, they had orchestrated this. They had written a fake lease, backdated it by a single day, rented out my property for $1, for 3 years, and then conveniently disappeared into the ether. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This was a scam, plain and simple. So yeah, I wanted my attorney to tear them apart. And it sounded like that was exactly what was going to happen. The admin told me that the moment he was able to check in, she'd have him call me directly, and I could tell him everything myself. Which meant I just had to hold on, take a breath, and let the legal machine start turning. Before I could even process the relief of that update, my phone buzzed again. My realtor. I picked up, half expecting more bad news, but this time, it was something else entirely. A plan. A next step. He wanted to meet up. Go over all the closing documents, go through everything with a fine-toothed comb, and, most importantly, get a drink. Which, honestly, felt almost laughable coming from me, the guy who doesn't really drink. But today felt like an exception. The evening, somehow, had found a way to get even more interesting. As I was processing all of this, my friend, the one who had graciously lent us the truck to hold all our belongings, sent a text. He was 5 minutes out with my car. I could practically feel the weight of the day pressing down on me, the exhaustion creeping into every muscle, but there was no stopping now. We had a meeting to get to. I let my wife know the plan, grabbed my keys, and braced myself for whatever was coming next. The drive felt surreal. Like my body was on autopilot, going through the motions while my mind kept replaying the last few hours over and over again. The deadbolt. The fake lease. The smirk on that guy's face as he vanished into our home. The way the police had shrugged it off like it was just another day. By the time we arrived at the restaurant, my realtor was already there, a stack of papers on the table, 2 drinks in front of him, one for himself, one presumably for me, whether I wanted it or not. The atmosphere of the place was warm, dimly lit, filled with the low hum of conversations that didn't involve legal battles or fraudulent leases. For a brief second, I almost let myself believe that this was just a normal night out. That I wasn't currently homeless because of a con artist. But reality snapped back into focus the moment I sat down. The conversation was a whirlwind. My realtor had been digging hard. And what he found only confirmed what I already knew, this wasn't some accidental oversight. The seller had executed this scam deliberately. And the best part? They hadn't covered their tracks well enough. The lease was badly written. Sloppy. There were contradictions, inconsistencies, things that didn't add up. The date format on the signature page didn't match the rest of the document. The font size was different in random places, like it had been copy-pasted together from other leases. And the payment? $1. That alone would make any judge look twice. And then, the biggest red flag of all, the timing. 1 day before our contract. Exactly 1 day. It was too perfect. Too precise. It was clear the seller had panicked and thrown this together at the last possible second. And that, my realtor told me, was our in. Because fraud. Fraud doesn't just get waved away in civil court. Fraud has teeth. As we pored over the documents, drink in hand, which, for the record, I barely sipped, my phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't even hesitate before answering. It was my attorney. His voice was sharp, clipped, focused. He had just seen my email. He had just read everything. And if I thought he was going to be hesitant or cautious, I was dead wrong. He was pissed. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that this was war. That this wasn't just some eviction case. That we weren't just going to get this guy out. We were going to go after the seller. Hard. He wanted everything. Every single piece of documentation. Every email. Every text. Every conversation my realtor had with the seller's agent. Every scrap of proof that this was fraud. Because the goal wasn't just to fix this, it was to bury the people who had done it. And as I sat there, listening to him lay out the next steps with the kind of ruthless precision that only comes from experience, I felt something I hadn't felt all day. Hope. For the first time since I had walked up to my own front door and found myself locked out, I felt like I was going to win this. I'll update tomorrow morning if not tonight, but till then. Thank you for the advice and reassurance. Wish me luck. Update 2. After everything that had already happened, I decided I needed to start putting names to the people involved. Referring to them as the female seller or the tenant was getting ridiculous, and if I was going to keep my sanity through all of this, I needed a way to keep track of all the moving parts. So here we go. The seller. Her name is Anne. Her ex, the guy who had apparently been involved in this mess, is Charlie. And the so-called tenant squatting in my condo? That's Bill. Rounding out the list is Diane, Anne's sister and, unfortunately for her, Bill's mother. With all that sorted, I could finally start wrapping my head around what the hell was actually going on. After the absolute mess on Wednesday, I met up with my realtor for dinner and to grab my closing documents. I needed something to ground me, something to remind me that, despite everything, I did legally own this place and that I wasn't just spiraling into some bizarre alternate reality where signing a mortgage meant getting locked out of my own home. We grabbed a table, and before we could even start getting into the documents, the seller's agent showed up. Now, that part was unexpected. He had actually arranged it with my realtor, which was honestly a decent move on his part. He walked in, looking genuinely embarrassed, and the first thing out of his mouth was an apology. He knew the family. He knew Anne. He was shocked that this had happened. And he was confident, absolutely sure, that this would be sorted out quickly. I didn't get my hopes up. I'd had enough of people telling me everything was going to be fine when, in reality, I was staring down the barrel of an eviction process that could have dragged on for months. Still, he insisted. And to his credit, he actually picked up our tab and bought a round of drinks while he was there. So hey, when life hands you lemons, make a superhuman amount of whiskey. I don't think that's how the saying goes, but that was my approach, and I stand by it. The next morning, I finally got in touch with Anne. I was expecting defensiveness. I was expecting excuses. What I got instead was pure, unfiltered rage. But not at me. At Bill. That's when I learned that Bill wasn't Charlie's nephew. He was Anne's. That changed everything. I had spent the last day assuming that this was some scheme between Charlie and Bill, that the two of them had cooked up this nonsense together, but it turned out Charlie had nothing to do with it. He was just the inspiration. Anne was furious. She told me she had no idea that Bill had pulled this stunt, and if she had, she would have shut it down immediately. She promised me, on the spot, that the apartment would be vacant ASAP, even if that meant physically dragging Bill out herself and paying for movers to take his stuff. She didn't care. She wanted this handled. She also assured me that she would cover whatever costs I had incurred from this ordeal. The moving truck, the temporary storage, the fact that my wife and I had been scrambling to find a place to stay, all of it. From there, she told me she needed to check in with her sister, Diane, who was already dealing with Bill as we spoke. She would call me back as soon as she had an update. But again, she made one thing crystal clear: worst case scenario, Bill would be starting to move out by early afternoon. That was a timeline I could live with. Sure enough, half an hour later, my phone rang again. It was Anne, and this time, she had actual progress to report. Diane had rented a truck. Bill was packing. And then, for the first time, I got a glimpse into why this had even happened in the first place. It turned out that Bill had recently gone through something pretty awful. I wasn't given the full details, but from what Anne told me, it had left him in a really bad headspace. He had become fixated on seeking approval from adult male figures, especially the ones who projected some kind of authority or strength. And at the top of that list? Charlie. Charlie, apparently, had hit some kind of midlife crisis and decided to reinvent himself as a biker. Bought a Harley. Started carrying himself like some badass outlaw, even though, from what I gathered, the guy was about as intimidating as a weekend warrior accountant playing dress-up. But Bill bought into it. Hook, line, and sinker. He wanted Charlie's approval so badly that he cooked up this entire scam as a way to impress him. A lot of people had already assumed that this was a cash for keys extortion attempt. They were right. Bill had banked on the idea that a doctor from NYC would just pay up immediately to make the problem go away. There was just one tiny flaw in that brilliant plan. I'm not a doctor. I'm not from New York City. But you do you, Chuck. Now, this was the part where I expected Anne to wrap things up, to tell me I could check in later to confirm that the unit was clear. Instead, she threw me a curveball. She and Diane were completely fine with me pursuing this with the police. They understood. They didn't even try to talk me out of it. But before that happened, Anne had a request. She wanted me to meet Bill in person. Not to negotiate. Not to argue. Not to change my mind about anything. But because she wanted him to look me in the eye and apologize. She wanted him to see, firsthand, that his actions hadn't just been some theoretical game. That he hadn't just scammed a faceless entity. That he had hurt a real person. I wasn't sure how I felt about it at first. Part of me thought, what's the point? The other part, though, saw an opportunity. Because if I met Bill, that meant I could get inside the unit. I could see the condition of the place before anything else happened. I agreed to it. I was hoping to see if I could get in to check the condition of the place anyway. Update 3. Yesterday evening, I finally went up to the apartment to meet my tenant. Or, well, former tenant. Bill was already outside, loading the last of his things into the truck Diane had rented for him. He looked like a kid who had just walked out of an avalanche, shell-shocked, exhausted, like his entire world had been knocked off its axis and he was still trying to figure out which way was up. I stood there for a moment, watching him, feeling that lingering resentment in my chest, the sheer frustration of everything I'd been through over the past few days. And then, as I took a step forward, something strange happened. The anger started to fade. Because standing in front of me wasn't some smug con artist. It wasn't a seasoned scammer trying to weasel his way out of trouble. It was just a 19-year-old kid who had completely, utterly, catastrophically screwed up his life in record time. We wound up talking for a while, and, look, I know this is going to disappoint some of you, but I walked away from that conversation not hating him. The truth is, Bill is just a dumb kid who got manipulated by an actual piece of garbage. There were tears. There were apologies. And I believe, completely, that this wasn't about regret over getting caught. This was actual remorse, the kind that hits when you've gone too far down a path and only realize how bad it is when it's too late to turn back. And here's the part where I just say it outright, because I don't think I was being as slick as I'd hoped in trying to dance around it before. Bill had family reasons. And I'm not going to screw up his life with a criminal record over a ridiculously stupid mistake that he was, in many ways, manipulated into making. For whatever it's worth, if the absolute worst thing I had done at 19 was getting caught up in some harebrained scheme like this, I'd probably be in a very different place right now. I was an absolute idiot at that age. Stupid. Reckless. The only reason I didn't end up facing real consequences is because I was lucky. And if I hadn't been? If someone had decided to throw the book at me instead of giving me a second chance? My life could have turned out very, very differently. So yeah, I'm letting this one go. That said, as far as the money is concerned, Ann and I are sorting that out. I don't want to go into the details because it involves her personal life, but let's just say Charlie is paying for it. Which, considering Charlie was the one who inspired this entire disaster to begin with, feels incredibly appropriate. And immediately started making things right, too. First thing she did. Hired movers to unload my truck. As I was sitting there, watching everything unfold, my stuff was already being carried inside, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could actually breathe again. And the apartment? Shockingly good condition. I mean, look, I'm basing this on what 19-year-old me would have done passively to an apartment, which means my expectations were somewhere in the scorched earth category. But honestly, no real damage. A few light scuffs on the walls from moving furniture, some minor cosmetic stuff, but nothing I actually care about. Especially since I'm planning to renovate before renting it out anyway. None of this is going to matter in the long run, so I'm not even going to waste the energy worrying about it. Now, on to Charlie. I've mentioned before that my attorney, capital M, capital A, because he has officially reached force of nature status, is a super intense older guy who, despite being technically retired, cannot sit still long enough to actually retire. Turns out, in addition to being a menace in court, he's also a goddamn bloodhound. And he is out for blood. We did a little digging, and guess what? Charlie has assets. Not a lot, mind you, but enough that my attorney is very confident that they will soon become my assets. And you know what? That is fine by me. I also had a brief chat with one of the officers who came by on Wednesday. Turns out, he's a friend of Diane's. Because of course he is. This everyone knows everyone small town dynamic is still throwing me for a loop, but in this case, it actually works in my favor. He had already heard about the situation and was happy to walk me through what needed to be done next. Which means later this week, I'll be heading down to the station to issue a formal statement and file a report. Now, I know some of you were worried that Charlie might have fled the country. I regret to inform you that Charlie is, in fact, very much still here. Anne, Diane, an officer friend of Diane all found this idea hilarious. Apparently, Charlie leaving the county, let alone the country, is not a thing that happens. This man is the human embodiment of a townie. He barely leaves his neighborhood, let alone crosses state lines. And when the time comes for him to be picked up, he'll be right there at one of his usual watering holes, thinking he got away with it. And, for the record, I am not one of those people who throws around assumptive diagnoses for fun. But I am making a very special exception in this case, because I have decided that Charlie has full-blown antisocial personality disorder. Does he actually? I don't care. It makes me feel better to believe it, so that's what I'm going with. Anyway, I've been typing this piecemeal throughout the afternoon, which has essentially been a test of my wife's patience. And I am not dumb enough to incur the wrath of a tiny Puerto Rican woman who has spent the last 2 days stressed out of her goddamn mind. So I'm gonna call this a post. Thanks again to everyone who gave advice, shared sympathy, and generally helped me keep my sanity through this absolute train wreck. I am lucky as hell that it ended the way it did. P.S. If Ahmad could let me know how to report the lawyers who slid into my DMs to advertise their services, that would be wonderful. Pro tip to lawyers: Reddit PMs are not the place to advertise your firm. It does not inspire confidence in your legal acumen.